Making something new or different or innovative in any skill or trade is really just a small degree of change, a small variation of the original. What I mean by this musically is if you're thinking by genre, a small rhythm change, different sound choices in that same groove, tempo changes, or small nuances in the drum cadence are all good ways to bleed genres or feels together. Too much can sound like a force, and I could go down my own rabbit hole on methods and philosophies that I subconsciously or consciously think about on this topic, but that may be a video for another day or a life's work for my listeners to unpack when I'm done. Plus, I'm always still figuring it out. But anyway, I wanted to go over a little history lesson to tie this all back in, so let's start. The first variations of music making machines were built many centuries ago. And they weren't built for making music, obviously, but were built to track time. Clocks. It was watchmakers of the 18th century in Switzerland who would go on to make the foundational concepts for music boxes, in which a coiled spring rotated a cylinder with bumps on its surface. These bumps struck metal tins that produced musical tones spaced in time. Then, shortly after that, another machine powered by a spring and pendulum was soon created. This machine was to help musicians themselves measure time more precisely, the metronome. Now, skipping ahead a bit to 1920, Russian inventor Leon Theremin would create a device that produced a wavering tone that could be raised or lowered in pitch by moving his hands within the machine's electromagnetic field. Sound synthesis. Theremin would also go on to work on ways to remove his hands from this process, thus creating very early versions of drum machines with his rhythmicon. By 1952, American composer and inventor as well, Raymond Scott, would take these concepts a step further. He would go on to create a keyboard version of the theremin called the Clavivox, which he was assisted by a young technician, Bob Moog. Scott rigged up and used this machine to go on and make the first commercial recordings of electronic music, with jingles for large companies like IBM and General Motors, just to name a couple. These new otherworldly sounds from these devices were not made to appease and soothe the ear of people accustomed to traditional musical instruments, but were made for an atomic generation who fetishized the sounds of the future, the bleep bloops, sounds of space, spaceships, UFOs. Scott's machines made music that literally sounded like machines. So, as the 1960s rolled around, electronic music was available and accessible to everyone, and the use began to spread. The Wurlitzer Sideman was the first commercially produced drum machine, and Bob Moog had created the pioneering synthesizer that has its name, the Moog. The Moog made many appearances on many Motown records and even on some records by the Beatles. The one drawback about the Moog was that it was monophonic, which means it could only generate one note at a time, which is great for creating melodies, but not at all for crafting chords. So, by the end of the decade, musicians Bob Margouleff and Malcolm Cecil would string together a number of Moog modules to create the world's first polyphonic synthesizer, the Tonto, or just Tonto. And at the dawn of the 1970s, Stevie Wonder himself would be the first artist to create a body of work with it, Talking Book, featuring timeless classics like Superstition, You and I, and You Are the Sunshine of My Life. He was the first to do it. So, as I came to find this information out, it made me wonder, no pun intended, where and who in our era in 2024 is making the new cutting edge sounds and or technologies that have yet to be put together or used, or where can I get as close to that innovation as possible? So this is my mindset I'm taking and new approach when making music. Artists from that golden era of music, as some would call it, were genuinely making music no one had ever heard before with new machines and inventions people literally had never used, which gave it that fresh and original sound. sounds and rhythms that were slightly different from the classic pianos or strings they were birthed from, but created a new sound. This is a new approach, like I said, I'm taking in my music and seeing where it leads me to break into new territory. Thanks for listening.